All right, let's get right into it. Today, we are digging into a massive economic story, a complete reversal of fortunes that totally reshaped a subcontinent. We're going to investigate how India went from being basically a global manufacturing giant to an agricultural colony.
To really get a sense of just how huge this change was, listen to this observation from back then. Almost everything relating to dress or furniture was supplied by Indian trade. Think about that. In the 17th and 18th centuries, India was the workshop of the world. Its high-quality textiles, things like muslin, calicos, silks, they were in demand everywhere. It was a true manufacturing powerhouse with a thriving, balanced economy.
And yet, just a century or so later, the world's leading exporter of finished textiles, was now primarily importing them. I mean, it went from a producer nation to a consumer market. That is a staggering transformation, a complete 180.
So this brings us right to our central question. How on earth did this great reversal actually happen? Well, let's dig in and trace the steps. Okay, let's dive into this. And to do that, we first need to get our terms straight, right? The entire process really hinges on one key concept: deindustrialization. At its core, it's a pretty simple idea. Deindustrialization is what happens when a country's industrial sector shrinks or gets wiped out entirely. But it's not just about closing factories. It's a profound social and economic shift. And in India's case, it set off a really powerful chain reaction.
This right here shows the devastating domino effect. It all starts with deindustrialization, the loss of industry. This naturally leads to deurbanization, as all those now jobless artisans have to leave the cities. That in turn fuels ruralization, a huge population shift back to the villages, which puts immense pressure on farmland. And the final domino to fall? Peasantization, where skilled craftspeople end up as landless agricultural laborers.
So what kicked off this whole domino effect? Well, the answer lies in a series of very deliberate policies that created a deeply unfair economic relationship. You could call it a one-way free trade.
Now, this wasn't some accident. It was policy, plain and simple. British manufacturers felt threatened by superior Indian goods, so they lobbied their government hard. The timeline here starts as early as 1700, with an act banning many Indian textiles. Then, in 1720, the Calico Act imposed hefty fines on anyone even caught wearing or selling Indian silks. But the real final blow came in 1813 with the Charter Act. That's what threw the doors wide open for cheap, machine-made British goods to just flood the Indian market.
Now, a policy is only as powerful as your ability to actually enforce it, right? So this map shows British-controlled areas in the early 1800s. As you can see, their control is significant, but it's far from total.
Okay, let's jump forward to the mid-1800s. This is right around the time these trade policies were really starting to bite. Notice how much that territory has expanded. Gaining this political power was absolutely essential to destroying regional competition and enforcing these new economic rules across the subcontinent. And by the late 1800s, control is nearly absolute. So this sequence of maps shows a really crucial point. The expansion of political power and the implementation of these economic policies went hand in hand. You can't separate them. So what did all that political control enable? Well, it enabled a unilateral free trade policy. You can see the dynamic right here. For Britain, it meant an open gate, unrestricted one-way access to the huge Indian market. But for India, that gate was locked. After 1820, European markets, which were once key customers, were pretty much sealed off to its exports. So, we've seen the policies and the power dynamics. Now let's look at the staggering numbers to see the real-world impact of this shift from producer to market. In 1813, right as that Charter Act came into force, the total value of British exports to India was just £11,000. I mean, that's a tiny amount. Now, look at this. By 1856, that number had absolutely exploded to £656,000. The floodgates were well and truly open. That's a nearly 60-fold increase in just over 4 decades. The speed and the scale of this economic takeover were just breathtaking. India was being rapidly transformed into a captive market for British industry. Now let's look at the other side of the coin, what India was exporting out. This table from 1856 is so telling. Look at the value for finished cotton cloth, highlighted there, once India's crown jewel. Now compare that to the value of raw cotton at the top.
The country wasn't selling its valuable finished products anymore. It was exporting cheap raw materials just to feed British factories. And, several other factors inside India basically poured gasoline on the fire. The decline of the traditional ruling class meant artists and craftsmen lost their main patrons. A new Western-influenced middle class started to emerge that often preferred English goods. And the new railway networks, built by the British, were incredibly effective at pushing these machine-made products into the most remote corners of the country. This wasn't just a change in trade statistics on some ledger. This reversal had a deep, lasting, and, frankly, a devastating human and economic cost. This one statistic right here really drives the point home. In 1809, nearly 19% of the population depended on industry for their livelihood. As you can see from the chart, by 1901, that number had been cut by more than half to just 8.5%. We're talking about millions of people being pushed out of their traditional professions. The consequences were profound. It led to the loss of centuries-old skills in art and craftsmanship. It completely shattered the balanced traditional economy, making the population dangerously over-reliant on agriculture. And this, in turn, contributed to widespread poverty and devastating famines. India had been systematically transformed into an agricultural farm for Great Britain. Which leaves us with a final and very complex question. Was this entire process a deliberate, calculated conspiracy to enrich one nation at the expense of another, or was it simply the inevitable, impersonal outcome of a technologically superior industrial revolution just crushing its competition? The how is pretty clear, but the why, well, that remains a topic of intense debate.